A Glance in the Mirror, Chapter 7. The Aftermath of War. The war had a profound effect upon Albert, whose life afterwards was never the same. He relived his time in France throughout the rest of his life, as I'm sure many did. He never trusted staff officers, and certainly not the generals. He thought them inefficient and uncaring. His experiences played an important part in shaping his military service in the next war, and clouded many judgments thereafter. In his award citation, it makes clear that he considered his men first at all times, and felt responsible for their well-being. The citation reads, "He shows the greatest energy and efficiency, determined and cool in action. He has set an inspiring example to all the junior non-commissioned officers and men of his company. He was present at the first battle of Ypres and Cambrai in 1917, the enemy offensive at Vimy Ridge in 1918, Arras the same year, and later at Marylebone." When the troops were demobilized, the cry was back to normal. Lloyd George had promised Britain would become a land fit for heroes. A general election in 1919 retained the coalition party of mainly Conservatives in power, led by Lloyd George. They remained in power until 1922. Unemployment was the most persistent problem. The returning troops were allowed to return to their old jobs, and this naturally forced out those who had replaced them. Those who were used to new production standards and methods brought about by mass production techniques. It also turned out most of the women who filled the jobs of conscripted men. The men returning were 4 years older. Some had been promoted to senior ranks, given authority and responsibility. They found it difficult to cope with dissatisfied workers clinging to the shirt-tails of trade union officials. Soon many began to feel disillusioned, believing that they had sacrificed much for a few to become rich. Industry began to feel the pinch as customers cut back. Factories lost their contracts for armaments, finding it hard to turn to peacetime products. Overseas customers had been neglected. The retooled factories had to compete with them, existing manufacturers, and all this led to firms laying off workers. The troops that returned home took up their previous employment, and as they did so, the women who had been doing some of those jobs were dispensed with, pushed aside to find work in domestic service, the retail trade and clothing industry. Britain had to change from war production to peacetime, using worn-out machine tools and inappropriate production lines. It was an impossible task. There was no chance of amassing sufficient capital from a depleted order book to reach the pre-war investment position. The government was advised by the Bank of England to make the pound the same value as the pre-war dollar, nearly $5 to the pound, convertible to its value in gold. The result made British exports more expensive, reduced demand, cut productivity, and naturally increased unemployment. The country already had a large number of unemployed. Employers knew they could replace discontented workers. They also knew they could lower the price of their goods if they reduced wages, which they did. The workers were already paid very little. They objected to a further reduction. It wouldn't be true to believe that it was only the workers who suffered greatest from the terrible waste of human life. To encourage men to enlist, the War Department set up enlisting officers in each town and major industry, calling for all fit men. This naturally meant that the men making up a battalion knew each other, went to school together, danced with the same girls, married within the circle, and were of the same social network. In many of the battles, some battalions lost over half the men, as did the Kensingtons. Other men from the same holding battalions back home replaced them early on. Once again, when in battle, more men were lost, and this meant in certain towns and sections of society whole swathes of men were missing. When the troops went over the top, they were led by mainly junior officers, and it was these junior officers who were also from the same catchment areas, supplying the enlisted men. In many battles, some battalions lost all their junior officers, and these men were in the main from the upper middle classes, from the landed gentry. After the war, many of the families owning large estates, holding positions of responsibility, likely to be future heads of the family, were dead. In many cases their younger brothers were dead too. In time their parents were too old and impoverished to retain and manage the family home, the family business and the estate, and these were broken up and sold to maintain their only home, which ultimately too became too much and was sold. In this way the countryside lost the traditional squire in his manor house, and the once fine estate was sold, split up, and sold off piecemeal, some to be for building land. The countryside was never the same again, and as this happened, startling gradually after the war until the older, moneyed population had died off by about 1938. 20 years after the war ended, the social classes lost a top to the tier to the class. Shortly it was to lose a tier at the bottom. The First World War sounded the death knell of the next generation of landed gentry, and to some extent to the aristocrats as well. It speeded up what was likely to take place by natural evolution. Taxation, in the form of death duties, saw to it that over a period there would be a redistribution of wealth. The Enclosure Act forced some of the poor off the land. They gravitated, as did others, to the towns and factories. The agricultural depression at the end of the 19th century changed the balance of the working population between town and country. The war hurried this change along. The 1919 budget raised death duties to 40% to estates over 2 million. 1 million acres of land were sold over that year. By the end of 1921, a quarter of England had changed hands. A quarter of agricultural land had passed from being tenanted into that of the farmer owner. Land sales had reached their peak. 3 years of land sales now, the new owners totted up what their purchasers had given them. The repeal of the Corn Production Act saw massive grain imports from Canada, America and Russia. The price of cereals plummeted. What large estates had survived started again to be split up, and houses attached to them sold off to become detached dwellings. A quarter of the country houses were torn down or left derelict, and by the first years of the Second World War there was less arable land, and what land there was not being farmed properly. It took the war and the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries to take Britain closer to self-sufficiency. The result of all this, a large reduction of wealth owned by the top 1% of the population, mainly the landed gentry, and this land found its way to the next social layer down. 75% of Britain's population still held less than £100 in their estate. The change in the population's occupations from country to town, from work in the land to work in the production line, gave an opportunity for skills learned and entrepreneurship to blossom. This flattened out the social class graph and reduced the layers. Within this now reduced or flattened out layer of wealth is accorded a class position defined by occupation, background, education, speech, fashion and hobby, giving social structure. After demobilisation, Albert returned to the Great Central Railway at Marylebone Station, taking over running the transportation of freight, During the war, GCR had taken over TM&C, another freight company, owing to the congested state of the railways brought on by the surge in industrial production and the movement of people. The government allocated 24 ex-MOD motors to the GCR company. Many other companies were now using motor drivers, which created a shortage of trained drivers. Albert's task was to enroll the temporary drivers from a pool of unemployed men and test them to see if they were experienced enough to drive heavy goods vehicles. Meanwhile, he continued to attend the Kensington Lodge, with 7 other brethren presented his Grand Lodge certificate. Later that year, on the 1st of October, he was installed as appointed Lodge organist. He was also a founder member of the Old Contemptible Association, an association of men who had been in the original mobilization of the Territorial Army in 1914. His hobby was photography. He had his own plate glass camera and tripod, and did his own developing. And by now his parents and family were living in Harvest Road, Bayswater. The railways were expanding after the restrictions felt during the war. Many of the army wagons were allocated to the railways to relieve the build-up of vehicles parked in dumps. Albert realized the changes this would make to an organization limited to horse transport. He submitted a plan to the senior management, a scheme whereby horse teams retrained onto motor wagons by rota, making provision for suitable cover. The plan was accepted and given charge of running the training scheme. The introduction of motors stimulated the sharing of rounds and districts. Whole areas could be integrated, eventually leading to an enormous transport system. He personally drove a wagon to check each delivery round, ensuring that the times estimated for each delivery were possible. His methods became so successful that he was asked to introduce a similar scheme for both King's Cross and Bishopsgate depots. The period from the general strike in 1928, when the union leaders fully appreciated the political implications of their industrial action wouldn't lead anywhere, till today, has seen the integration of the unions into all processes of government. State assistance to particular industries integrated the government into both what the managements and the unions wanted, and this was necessary with the beginnings of rearmament and ultimately war. The general strike set the growth of the unions back, losing 500,000 members from the Congress. The discontent of the railway workers was still being felt in the industry. Wages were very low, unemployment high. The men were, through their unions, threatening to strike to try to force up wages. There was a railway strike that year, and Albert was asked to drive and deliver a load using a motor wagon to help maintain deliveries and at the same time break the strike. He also helped feed and harness the horses while still keeping up his office duties. If there were a motor left in the station by the time the senior manager arrived, the matter would have to be explained and accounted for. The following year the Conservatives won a convincing election. What was significant was the Labour Party became the second party for the first time. The Trades Union Council called for a general strike to support the miners who were already on strike against wage cuts and longer hours. Although it was called a general strike, it was only for key workers in transport, iron and steel, building, printing and electricity. Naturally, enough of this had the effect of shutting down most union-controlled businesses for want of power. And even though the strike was over quickly, the effects of this, on top of the returning the pound to the gold standard, was that the country stayed in recession. The government feared complete industrial and social dislocation, which seemed inevitable. There were thousands of trained officers and men in civilian life, and a sufficiency of army transport. The Territorial Army was a considerable force. Albert was ordered to help break the strike, using his position as regimental sergeant major in the Territorials and as a manager of one of the railway company's freight distributors. His prime position put him in place to organize a civilian response. Plans were made to stock food and petrol. Reliable men drove underground trains, buses, and used their private cars as taxis. The trade unions had been given convincing proof that this was going on, and that the rest of the country was not prepared to see chaos. Arrangements were made for the Territorial Army to act as auxiliary police, and even be paid a subsidiary allowance. They had little to do for the strikers, for the strike soon ended. However, the trades union were left in no doubt of the effective use which could be made of the territorial force. Albert, managing the distribution and collection of freight from Paddington Mainline Station, organised his managers, officer workers and sympathetic university students to carry on moving the freight, and when possible he loaded and drove a team of horses, in company with others, all through the strike period. The Transport and General Workers' Union financiers were in dire straits. Not only were the union losing members, but also those that were members were not paying their membership fees. There were no factories in many outer London suburbs, large offices or distribution centres. Most of the men and the few women who were working were white-collar workers. The majority of outer London citizens voted Conservative who were in office, and this was the time of Baldwin's second ministry. The country's unemployment figures rose to 1.25 million. This figure gradually increased, adding a further million. A year later, the figure rose to almost 3 million. The unemployment peak was found in coal mining, iron and steel production, shipbuilding and textiles. After that peak there was a decline until the 1930s, and from there on in the figures climbed back to those of the peak 6 years later. All these industries were mainly found in the north, Wales and Scotland, the south of England, and in the southeast, particularly southern cities and town suburbs, the population fared considerably better. Chamberlain forced down interest rates, which kicked off the house-building boom. Great Britain started to emerge from the Great Depression. Albert was by now 37 and still regarded as Thompson Mackay personnel, and this meant that its workers were barred from applying for cartage work on the Great Central Railway. It was a closed shop, and this restriction eventually lifted because the railways complained that there wasn't enough freedom of movement. However, being trained and employed by firms other than those within the railway industry meant that workers were stigmatized when applying for work in any of the railway companies. So serious was the general strike 2 years before, and on the well-being of the company, that it was agreed in 1928 for all the staff to accept a 2.5% reduction in fees, salaries and wages. The previous trade boom ended a depression, saw markets shrinking, industry was declining and unemployment rising. This situation continued until 1930, and even then there was an agreement by some trade unions not to seek a wage review until the end of that year. In 1931, Albert was appointed inner guard at the Masonic Lodge. This advancement in Masonic life was a prelude to his installation as worshipful master the following year. Annually, the ceremony of installation was performed at the Ladies' Festival, held at the Clarendon Restaurant, Hammersmith. The organisation and invitations were the business of the new master, who sent out 145 invitations to the dance, costing 18 and sixpence each. And naturally, important guests were invited free to sit at the top table. That year the main guest was Mrs. Roper of Chard Abbey. It was the norm that her companion for the evening accompanied her. Elsie May Collins was not long out of the mill, and this move up the social ladder was eagerly grasped. Mrs. Roper could see the change in her companion and was excited by the transformation. It was going to be an interesting evening. During the event, Albert's official duty was to see that his guests were happily entertained by making sure their dance cards were filled. His attention also directed towards Mrs. Roper's companion, Elsie, whom he invited to dance. Within the year, Albert and Elsie were betrothed, Albert choosing his brother Edward as best man. They were married by the resident vicar, Frank Rothwell, at St. John the Evangelist, Tatworth. The wedding breakfast, held at Rosalie Cottage, was attended by the whole extended family, and after the wedding he went back to working as a cartage manager based at Paddington Mainline Station. During the weekends at the territorial camps, he performed the duties of the regimental sergeant major, based at its drill hall and headquarters at Iverna Gardens. Elsie was now destined to become a suburban housewife after a lifelong attachment to the country and village life.